review for lab stuff if you haven't taken a look at it yet. Some of this is a nice review for the different divisions and parts of the brain. All right, the adult brain is divided into 4 major regions. The cerebral hemispheres, also called cerebral cortex, also called the cerebrum, the outer parts of the brain. Yes, we've got 2 outer parts. It's the largest parts of the brain. The diencephalon, which is my purple structure in the middle, the brainstem, which is my green structure in the middle, and the cerebellum, which is kind of the orangish, reddish color that hangs out underneath the back of the brain. We're going to look at each of these parts, look at the divisions, look at what they do, which again is a lot of review for lab. So the cerebral hemispheres, yes, we've got 2 of them. We have a left one and we have a right one. The left hemisphere controls the majority, but not all, of language, math, and logic, whereas the right hemisphere has more control over your visual spatial skills, intuitions, emotional, and if you're artistic or musical. So you may have heard people say, oh, I'm left-brained or I'm right-brained. You know, I'm all left brain. I'm all math and logic. I'm not artistic. You've seen my artistic abilities. I'm not musical. I played, piano in like 2nd grade. That's about it. I'm more math and logic type person. Other people are more emotions, artistic, musical. And again, that doesn't mean you are only one or the other. Yes, the hemispheres do communicate. You can have a little bit of both. I can draw a little bit. But some people have a stronger left hemisphere working versus a right, like myself, or vice versa. But they do communicate with each other. There is information that goes back and forth between the 2. I was going to say, I don't talk a whole lot more about that. We're going to move right into the middle part of the brain. The diencephalon. And the picture that I showed before was all that purple right in the middle of the brain. It's got different parts of it. The 3 that we're going to talk about are the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. Also in the diencephalon, you have the 3rd ventricle. What do you find inside of the ventricles? The cerebrospinal fluid. So it's in that diencephalon area, you find that 3rd ventricle. Now, based on the names, thalamus, where are you going to find hypothalamus? Below it. Based on its name, where are you going to find epithalamus? Above. Now, that's my one thing. The epithalamus, although it has the name epi, so you think it should be on the thalamus, it's actually behind the thalamus. It's this different color purple. It includes the pineal gland as well as some other fibers. It's one of those names where you're like, so glad you guys learned all these prefixes and what they all mean, but the epithalamus is one of those weird ones. The epithalamus is actually behind or dorsal to the thalamus, not on the thalamus. So I have no idea why they called it epi. I'd call it dorsal thalamus or something, or posterior thalamus or something. All right, so looking at different parts of it, starting with the thalamus, which is the large oval purple right here in the middle. On your sheep's brains, it was a perfect circle. The thalamus is the largest part of the diencephalon. It's a gateway to the cerebral cortex. So it's the gateway that sends information up to that whole cerebral cortex, the cerebral hemispheres, where most of your thinking happens. The thalamus helps sort, edit, and relay information. So it gets information from the hypothalamus below it. It gets information from the cerebellum and the basal nuclei on the sides of it. It has lots of information going into the thalamus, and the thalamus relays it to different parts of the outer part of the brain for processing. That's why I usually say the thalamus is just like your triage when you go to the doctor. You go in, you visit with the triage nurse, they ask you a whole bunch of questions, and then they figure out where you should go next and which doctor you should see. The thalamus, you have all this information coming in, it figures out what information is coming in, and then where it should send it after that. So it sorts and relays information. It has a little bit to do with mediating and interpreting sensations, motor activities, the movement of your body, some cortical arousal, the fact that you've got different parts of the brain working, and stimulating them, some learning and some memory. Now, as we go through different parts of the brain, you'll notice that more than one part of the brain has some influence over motor function and your skeletal muscles. Different parts of the brain have influence over memory. Other parts of the brain, multiple parts of the brain have influence over emotions. Some are stronger than others, but they all have some influences in these areas. Now, the hypothalamus, which is hanging out right below the thalamus, The biggest thing is it controls your autonomic nervous system, which is what? What is the autonomic nervous system? Yeah, it's all involuntary stuff that you have no control over it. It's because the hypothalamus controls it. So your heart beating, how fast it beats, your blood vessels, whether you're sweating or not, like all of that stuff is all controlled by that hypothalamus. It also, in addition to that, has some responses to emotions, mostly because the limbic system, which we'll talk a little bit later, is right next to it. So it can perceive emotions such as pleasure, fear, rage, other biological rhythms, other biological drives like sex drives. It can respond to that type of information. It helps regulate body temperature, so if you're cold, you shiver. If you're hot, you sweat. It regulates your hunger and satiety, which means, are you hungry, are you full? And it also regulates water balance. It will tell you if you're thirsty or not. So I'm like, it's got a lot of things that happens. That little tiny kind of triangle area underneath the thalamus does a lot of different things. And then the epithalamus, which really isn't on it because it's in the backside, so it's the dorsal portion, the back area of the diencephalon. The main part of it is where you find the pineal gland. The pineal gland makes a hormone called melatonin. Have you heard of it? It's the hormone that makes you tired. And so as it starts to accumulate in your brain, it makes you start to feel more and more tired. If you're not making enough of it, you can even buy melatonin over the counter, and you can take some melatonin and it makes you tired and it makes you fall asleep. So it helps regulate that sleep-wake cycle depending on your levels of melatonin in your body. All right, the brain stem, again, there's 3 major regions. And don't you wish all your sheep's brain looked just like this? It's like the most beautiful little brain ever. Although this is a human brain, but the 3 major regions of the brain stem, you've got the midbrain right there in the middle, the pons, which is an expanded, it kind of sticks up a little bit region, the medulla oblongata, and then it will go down and become the spinal cord. Now the question is, what do all of these things do? Well, the midbrain, which is right there at the top of the brain stem, it's between the diencephalon and the pons, right in between. It's in the middle part of the brain, hence the name midbrain. Its functions helps in pain suppression. So if you're a person, you're like, I can withstand a lot of pain, and some people can more than others, that's your midbrain. It has some stuff to do with visual reflex centers, because I'm going to say I have to go back. I'm like, in the midbrain region, this is your optic nerves, your optic tracts, your optic chiasma. All review. Again, it's going right past the midbrain, so it's where you've got some visual reflex centers there. You've got auditory relay centers, because if you go out from the midbrain this way, you're going to find an ear there. So your ear goes right there. And that's also linked to the basal nuclei, which has to do with, and we'll get into it, but has to do with some of your controlling your muscles and your motor function. The pons, right below it, so it connects the higher brain centers where all your thought process is happening and the spinal cord down below. So it relays information between the motor cortex and the cerebellum. So you can have information coming from the cerebellum going to the pons, and then it sends up further for processing and controlling movements. And it helps maintain your normal rhythm of breathing. It's what sets how many breaths you take per minute. Now, there are other parts in your brain that can change that, such as your hypothalamus is going to change the breathing. If you're under a lot of stress or scared, whatever, your breathing's going to increase. But it's the pons that's setting that number of breaths per minute at your resting rate. And then the last part of the brainstem, you have the medulla oblongata on the bottom. I bolded some of the big major ones. One, it has some stuff to do with your autonomic reflex center. And so some of its functions overlap with what the hypothalamus does. So things that, such as your heart rate and, how fast your heart is beating, how fast your breathing happens, things like that, your medulla oblongata has some control over. Mostly because it is your main cardiovascular center is in the medulla oblongata. Setting the rate of how fast and how strong your heart beats, whether your blood vessels dilate or constrict. For example, if you'd walk outside today because it's really cold, what's going to happen to the blood vessels in your skin? they're going to constrict. It's the medulla oblongata that controls that. And so I'm like, it controls blood vessel diameter constriction. It controls the beating of your heart rate. It also helps generate your respiratory rhythm. You know, so the depth of breath, not just the rate. It does help control a little bit with the rate, along with the help of, they call it the pontine center, the pons. So it does work with the pons right next door to help, you know, control how many breaths you take per minute and how deep those breaths are. And then a couple other additional centers of thing, you know, other things that that medulla oblongata can regulate: vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, and sneezing. Those are not as life-threatening, but I bolded the big ones. If you damage your medulla oblongata, because it controls your respiration and making so that you breathe, and it controls your cardiovascular, making it so that your heart beats, if you damage your medulla oblongata, what would happen? You would die. Your heart wouldn't, there'd be nothing that says that your heart should beat anymore. There'd be nothing that says that the muscles around your lungs should constrict and you would breathe. So yes, damage to the medulla oblongata is fatal. The cerebellum, that little area right at the back of the head that hangs down below, it's about 11% of your brain mass. It's dorsal to the pons, so it hangs out right below, right behind it. And the medulla, medulla oblongata is just short for medulla oblongata. It gets information from the cortex region of the brain. It gets information from the brainstem itself. Any sensory receptor information can go into that cerebellum for processing. But its big goal, its major function, it allows for smooth, coordinated movements. Like when we tell our muscles to do something, they're going to do that. If I want to pick up something, the normal reaction of my cerebellum's not working, it would be a very jerky motion. Like if I wanted to pick up a pencil, I'd be like, pick it up, and I'm like, a very jerky motion. However, the cerebellum's like, okay, well, we're not going to like pick it up and make it go flying anywhere. And I'm like, we're just going to slowly move that muscle so that you have a very fine motor control over it, so that you can move your body exactly how you want it to. So people that are, accomplished dancers have a very fine working cerebellum that allows them to move their body in all the parts of their body in very fine, smooth, coordinated motions. If you're a person, you have two left feet, you have no coordination whatsoever, you can blame that a little bit on your cerebellum. Now, when we cut the cerebellum in half, it has that little tree-like or little shrub-like pattern called the arbor vitae, or the tree of life. That's made up from the white matter that causes this. So you can see the little white branches. What can you tell me about white matter? That's where you find those myelinated axons in there. Now, Mike, so in those particular regions you have myelinated axons creating that white appearance. Now, some other things that the cerebellum can do that are more cognitive, the thinking versus, controlling skeletal muscles. It also helps a little bit with our thinking, processing information, can help with language, can help a little bit with emotions, not a big emotional part. It can also compare actual with expected outputs and adjust accordingly. So if you're the person that when you get on, I say not an escalator, but the ones that are just on a flat surface, and you step on it and you're just like, holy cow, and all of a sudden you're moving. And I'm like, or if you've ever gone on a ship where there's actual waves, not like the Mississippi, where there's actual waves going back and forth, I'm like that visual of I'm seeing something flat, I'm standing on a flat surface, but you're actually moving. It's what's compare actual with expected output, and it allows you to rebalance your body a little bit. Now a little review before we go on. So pull out your colored note cards. The pons belongs to which major brain region? I was like, now my review questions, I'm like, they're not really that hard today. Mostly because I kind of mentioned them all. Yes, it's part of the brainstem. It's one of the three parts of the brainstem. If you damage which of the following, it would result in death. It's like I highly, reviewed these. That's why I'm like, they're not hard at all. Yes, it's the orange medulla oblongata. And professional ballet dancers have a particularly efficient what area of the brain? Yes, it's the green, the cerebellum. Now we're going to look at one other part of the brain and what it does. And again, this is one of the ones that you couldn't see when we do a sagittal cut through a brain. It was one of the few that you had to do a frontal or coronal section to see. Was the limbic system. Now I'm not going to have a picture or anything that you're going to have to like point at the limbic system. The limbic system is hanging out in the middle of the brain, but it's part of the outer cortex regions. It's part of the diencephalon, but it's kind of hanging out right outside of it, but yet still in the middle area of the brain. So it's in the medial aspects of the cerebral hemisphere, so right in the middle, and in the diencephalon. Now, I was going to, like things that encircle the brain. Why I care about it, the limbic system, these little areas that you're not going to see doing a sagittal section because they're kind of hanging out on the edges. The limbic system is the big emotional part of our brain. So this is the big emotional part of the brain. So if you're a big emotional person, that's your limbic system that's just working like crazy all the time. It can recognize angry or fearful facial expressions, and it can assess any danger and elicit a fear response. So I'm like, it can notice if all of a sudden you see a whole bunch of people that look like they're totally afraid, you know, your body might start to react and be like, oh my goodness, there must be something really scary coming up. It can express emotions via gestures as well as resolve mental conflicts. So this is one, I'm like, when you are happy, what would be a gesture that your face would do? You would smile. And so I'm like, this is the one that you can, you know, express emotions via gestures. You know, I'm like, you can smile if you're happy, or you can scowl if you're mad. And I'm like, so it's going to kind of put some of those physical features to some of these emotions. It can also put emotional responses to odors. So if you smell a skunk, that's a smell. Well, now you're putting an emotional response to it, and you're like, that smells really bad, and now you're like, I don't like it, and I'm really kind of upset about that. You're putting some emotion to that really bad smell. Or if you really like the smell of something, you'd be like, oh, it makes me happy. It smells so good. Like, it puts emotional responses to different smells. A lot of smells that we, you know, breathe in go to this particular area for even processing. Now, it also, the limbic system, this emotional part, does interact with your prefrontal lobes, the front part of the cerebral cortex. So we can react emotionally to things we consciously understand to be happening. So we can, you know, watch a movie and understand everything's happening. You know, understand all the different complex things are going on, and you could be the person that cries at the movie because it's such a sad process going on. Or you could be laughing, but you understand all the different things that are happening, and it elicits an emotional response. So we're thinking about it and then putting an emotional response to it. It also makes us consciously aware of our emotional richness in our lives. You know, if you just had the best day ever and you're like, all these things are going right and I'm so happy, I'm just a happy person, you know, you understand, you're like, I've got wonderful family and friends and I'm such a happy person. And you could also have those days where you're like, I hate everyone and they're all horrible, and then you realize you don't have a lot of emotional richness that day. So you're thinking about it and can put emotions to it. Now, luckily, I'm like, that prefrontal lobe, the thinking part, and your emotions, luckily they do talk to each other, but sometimes for some people they don't talk fast enough to each other. For example, if someone just totally failed the lab or the lecture quiz today, and they're just like took the quiz and slammed down and say, I'm out of here, and stormed out in a big huge flurry, and all of a sudden you're like, what's going on? That's an emotional response, probably without thinking about it. And then as soon as that person would get out in the hall, they'd start to think about it like, oh, that's not a big deal. It's only a quiz, you know, it's not a big deal, whatever. You know, then they start to think about it and realize that they totally just acted emotionally without thinking about it. So luckily, they usually react, and if you totally failed the quiz, you know, you kind of think about it and you're like, oh, okay, it's not a big deal. And I'm not going to storm out of the room and make a big, huge scene. There are some people that information doesn't happen fast enough, and they're always the people making emotional scenes. The hippocampus, which is part of, as well as the, I was going to say like amygdaloid body, they're just two parts of the limbic system that have to do with different parts of emotions, and they play a role in memory. So you can think of some type of memory, and it makes you smile because you put emotion to that memory. You know, I'm like, or you can think about something, a memory comes up, and you get really sad or you get really mad. You're putting emotions to your memories as well. All right, so some review. This is lab, so I'm going to kind of skip through meninges a little bit. Yes, we've got different protections of the brain. One, there's bone to help protect it. We talked about bone enough in our skeletal system. I'm not going to talk about it. There are meninges. How many meninges do we have? It's a lab question. How many meninges? How many coverings? There are three. There are three meninges. Alrighty then. I can see how well you studied that part of the lab. We have cerebrospinal fluid as a cushion, and we have something known as the blood-brain barrier, which I want to try talking more about than the lab stuff. But your meninges, they cover and protect the central nervous system, both brain and spinal cord, same meninges, same order. They have blood vessels inside of it that can also enclose venous sinuses. These are just parts in the brain where you collect a lot of blood that's eventually going to go back to the heart. They contain cerebrospinal fluid in the subarachnoid space, and they form little partitions in the skull. Now, Mike, so you've got different areas in the skull where you've got the different, places where you find cerebrospinal fluid, different blood vessels inside that skull. Now, do they look familiar? The dura mater on the outside, you saw it on your sheep's brain, very durable. It's very tough. The arachnoid mater, named because it's got these wispy little spider web things hanging down underneath it into a space called subarachnoid space. And then you've got the Pia Mater, which is the thinnest, and it's attached directly to the spinal cord or the brain directly. Now, an inflammation of any of these different meninges is called meningitis. Heard of it? Yeah, and it's an inflammation of one of these. Now, usually a lot of times what happens in meningitis, you end up start getting... All right. This could be fun. More fire. Usually you start getting an accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid. So, you're going to have severe fevers over 105. They're going to have to drain cerebrospinal fluid. There are bacteria that can cause meningitis. There are viruses that can cause meningitis. And and if I remember correctly, I think it's a viral one that's really, really contagious. Yay. And then people that live in dorms that are in close quarters with each other, because it's very, very contagious, can spread from one person to the next. So there has been instances, I haven't heard any recently, where you might have, several people contracting a viral meningitis. Now, if it's the right one and if it's the right virus, unless you get to a hospital and get treatment within about 48 hours, you won't live. If you go on after that, there's nothing they can do. It will kill you. Because it's going to start attacking the brain. So I was going to say there are some colleges that if you live in dorms, you have to have the vaccination. I have no idea if Western's one of them. I don't even know if UWL is.
You have to sign a waiver
if you don't. That says it's okay, I can die. It's not a problem.
Basically.
I won't sue you. This picture should look familiar because it's right from lab, showing the two layers of the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, the subarachnoid space, and the Pia Mater attached to the brain. So that dura mater is the strongest layer. It's made up of two layers that form, various sinuses in there that can collect, it's almost like little areas. The arachnoid mater, it's named arachnoid because it's got a little web-like, spider web-like extensions coming down from it. It is underneath the dura mater. So underneath the dura mater, there is something called subdural space. It just has a very tiny film of cerebrospinal fluid. Thin enough, we don't really discuss it any more than the fact that there's a little space between those two. The subarachnoid space is where you have lots of cerebrospinal fluid, lots of blood vessels. And then the Pia Mater, which is attached directly to the brain, you also have blood vessels, very skinny blood vessels, but lots of them that are covering the brain tissue itself and covering the spinal cord. All right, some cerebrospinal fluid stuff. One, it's a watery solution that's formed from your blood plasma. So it's filtering out blood plasma, making cerebrospinal fluid. Biggest difference is there's not as many proteins in cerebrospinal fluid compared to your plasma, and they have different ion concentrations than your plasma. So we filter out certain things. Main reason why we want cerebrospinal fluid, it makes our central nervous system structures like our brain more buoyant. Reduces the weight of our brain by 97%. So our brain, the weight of our brain is not sitting squished on the skull bones that are in there. It's kind of floating around in there. It protects the nervous system from blows and other trauma. At some point in your life, I can guarantee you probably got smacked in the head or you hit against a wall or something like that. You shouldn't have had any, major brain damage from that, because your brain can move around in that little cavity up there and it's just fine. And it also nourishes the brain and carries chemical signals because of different ions and action potentials. This is showing, again, this lab picture. Most of your cerebrospinal fluid is getting made by ependymal cells in that choroid plexus. We've got the lateral ventricle, your third ventricle, your fourth ventricle, your cerebral aqueduct. All sound familiar? Now, the blood-brain barrier, which I think is my last topic. Yay. The blood-brain barrier. Yes, not everything that's in your blood makes it to our brain itself, which is a good thing. Your brain requires a very stable environment. We already talked about how we create action potentials. It's moving of ions. If all of a sudden you have ion concentration differences, you might not have enough sodium outside to move in. You might have too much sodium that wants to move in. Mike, if anything changes, that affects your brain functioning. So we don't want everything from the blood getting into your brain. So we have this blood-brain barrier. Now, which cell is a big one that helps control it? Those little astrocytes. If you remember, they help anchor that blood capillaries to neurons itself. They're also going to help regulate what goes from the blood to the brain and the neurons itself. So it helps separate neurons from different blood-borne substances. Now, some stuff can get through, some stuff can't. It is a selective barrier. Now, we do want certain nutrients to get into our brain. We want glucose. We do want several different electrolytes like sodium and chloride to get into our brain for them to function correctly. We do want them to move there. They move to the nervous system from the blood through facilitated diffusion. Just a little review. What's facilitated diffusion? Yeah, it has to go through one of those little carrier proteins. A carrier protein or channel protein just means diffusion, but with some help. Metabolic waste, proteins, toxins, most drugs, not all, some small non-essential amino acids, and potassium are all denied. They do not leave your blood and go into the nervous system because they're all going to have some detrimental effect if we have large amounts of these getting into the nervous system. Any fat-soluble substance can, however, pass into the nervous system. So alcohol, nicotine, and some anesthetics, things that make you go to sleep. Alcohol, you've probably seen or experienced this. Alcohol gets into your blood, gets into your central nervous system. You can't think properly anymore. You can't control body functions anymore. And it's affecting the central nervous system. Same thing happens with nicotine. And it makes your brain think differently. We'll get more into that in just a second. But it also prevents other waste like urea to penetrate so that you don't damage the cells because that would be toxic to the nervous system. Now, the blood-brain barrier is there to protect the brain. There is, however, areas such as the hypothalamus, there is no blood-brain barrier. And that's for survival because the vomiting trigger is located in the hypothalamus. It controls your vomiting sensation. The vomiting sensation can be something that, causes you to live or die. For example, if you drink enough alcohol, that gets in the central nervous system. The hypothalamus is going to tell you to vomit. And so drinking too much alcohol leads to vomiting. Because if you don't vomit, what could happen to you? Yeah, and it could shut down, and we'll talk later when we get into respiration, but it could kill you. And it could cause your medulla oblongata to not function anymore. And so we want to try to get rid of that alcohol out of our blood. So the hypothalamus monitors the composition of our blood and realizes too much alcohol is coming in. We need to try to get rid of it as much as possible before even more comes in, or it could cause death. Now, the blood-brain barrier, because some stuff can get in and some stuff can't, it does have to be considered when they make drugs, over-the-counter drugs, prescription drugs, things like that. Most drugs that you take cannot cross the blood-brain barrier. Not all. For example, if you go to the store and you have a cold, because my entire family are sick right now. If you go to the cold, and I've bought almost every single children's medicine off the counters in the last 2 weeks. If you read the labels on them, if you go and you buy some cough medicine, You'd like to take that. It gets into your bloodstream, and you're hoping that, the stuff in your blood gets to your lungs, not your brain. However, there are certain drugs that can cross the blood-brain barrier, and it's going to cause some type of effect on your brain, like you're tired, or you can't control body functions, like you can't control your skeletal muscles. Ones that can, pass through that blood-brain barrier usually have big old warnings. You should not operate heavy machinery while taking this, because it's going to have some type of effect on the central nervous system. Now, children, very, very young children, their blood-brain barrier has not developed very well yet. And so that's why I'm like, very young children cannot take very many over-the-counter medicines, because things that can't get into the brain for you guys can pass into the brains in young children. So that's why I'm like, if you ever look at children's medicine, which I've done a lot recently, some are for ages 6 and up, some are for ages 4 and up, some, you can't give to children under the age of 4, because I'm like, whatever medicine that's in there, it's going to cross into the central nervous system and could have some type of negative effect on the nervous system. All right. I have like 2 questions on here. Which of the following brain systems is heavily involved in mediating emotional responses? It's the only one we talked about. It's really hot in here. I'm like feeling heat. I was like, that's seriously where I'm getting heat from up here? Because I am feeling a ton of heat. But I don't know whether, I'm feeling a ton of heat up here. Is that thing kicking out heat? Yeah. I'm like dying up here. All right, it is the limbic system, the pink. And the last question, why is the blood-brain barrier ineffective against alcohol? It is green. Alcohol is lipid soluble, so it can cross into the central nervous system.